Ah, my ghostly guests. You're just in time for tonight's little seance. You know, some folks just can't let the dead rest in peace. They poke, they prod, they ask all the wrong questions, then act shocked when the answers claw their way back from the grave. Well, looks like tonight's tale comes straight from beyond the veil. A Halloween haunting where four foolish souls decide to try and chat with the dearly departed and found they were all too eager to talk back. So grab your candles, my curious cadavers, and listen well, because in this one, they might just answer. I call it Speak of the Dead. Halloween night, the thin night, the ancient night, when the veil between what is and what was frays to a single thread. In the sleepy, sun-bleached town of Harvest Falls, the last of the trick-or-treaters had been tucked away, leaving the streets to the chill, the mist, and the restless spirits of bored youth. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the faint, sweet smell of burnt sugar and decay. Leaves, dry, brittle husks of maple skittered across the cracked sidewalks, propelled by a nervous, intermittent wind. Jack-o'-lanterns, their faces beginning to soften and wilt from a night's work, flickered a defiant, tired orange on porches that had seen better days. The laughter of distant parents faded into the quiet, leaving behind only the lonely sound of their own footsteps. Four friends, caught in that uncomfortable space between childhood liberty and adult responsibility, wandered the deserted lanes in their half-hearted costumes. They were looking for a thrill, but finding only the predictable stillness of their own hometown. There was Zoe, the ringleader, sleek in a black cat suit with pointed ears, the picture of confident skepticism. She strode ahead, her eyes constantly scanning for something worthy of her attention. Eli, her boyfriend, lagged slightly behind, twitchy and unsure in a store-bought skeleton suit. He was already picking at the fake bone decals. Tara, the self-proclaimed Wiccan and resident goth, moved with a quiet, deliberate grace in her velvet vampire cape, her eyes heavy with manufactured world weariness. And finally, Kyle, the jock, loud and mocking, wearing a shredded football jersey, his face smeared with cheap green-gray makeup to approximate a zombie player. Zoe kicked an empty, crinkled Shriekers wrapper into the gutter, her eyes bored with the sight of the same old street. Well, this is it, the big night, she announced, her voice flat with disappointment. Guess the scariest thing about this Halloween is realizing you're going to spend the rest of your life watching the paint pill on this street. I mean, we're still here, walking the same pathetic sidewalk we did 10 years ago. Nothing ever changes. Eli shifted nervously. I don't know, Zoe. The way that fog's rolling in, it feels heavy. Feels like humidity, Eli. Zoe snapped back, without malice, just certainty. The only spirits in this town are the ones rotting in a bottle somewhere. They passed the old shuttered movie theater, now just a husk of faded brick, and the chained-up playground where, years ago, they'd huddled together to tell ghost stories about the local asylum. Now, it all looked rusty and sad. Tara, who had been silent, clutching a small, heavy canvas bag, smiled a thin, dark smile. The bag contained something hard and flat that rattled faintly when she walked. What's the cargo, Morticia? Kyle drawled, trying to sound mocking, but his voice was a little too loud in the quiet street. Tara's eyes gleamed with conviction. It's the antidote to our boredom, Kyle. You can't wait for the darkness to come to you. You have to invite it in. She unzipped the bag just enough for them to see the contents. A few beeswax candles, a small jar of coarse white salt, and a large, weathered Ouija board. The glossy surface was scratched, and its heart-shaped planchet had a visible, crooked crack running down the viewing hole. Eli gulped. You've got to be kidding. The mall psychic special? Kyle, however, grinned, his zombie makeup cracking around the edges. Now we're talking. I knew I liked you, Tara. You got fired. Where are we doing this? The abandoned cannery? Tara didn't hesitate. Her gaze lifted, drifting past the last street lamp toward the steep, dark knoll that dominated the town's eastern edge. It was crowned by a thicket of cypress and the looming, wrought iron geometry geometry of the oldest resting place in Harvest Falls. Where else? The 4 teenagers quickly secured their supplies, Kyle producing a tarnished silver flask of something cheap and stinging, and slipped off the pavement. Their quest for cheap thrills had just taken them past the point of no return. The initial atmosphere as they began to ascent toward the cemetery gates was still one of playful dares and nervous laughter. Eli shrieked when a stray branch grazed his neck. Kyle laughed, then scooped up a loose pebble and hurled it at a nearby porch, hitting an old plaster lawn ghoul that shattered with a hollow crack just to make everyone jump. But beneath the joking, a subtle change was taking place. The temperature was dropping fast, and the scattered mist was beginning to coil and thicken, not around the lamps, but low to the ground, like a predatory animal. The wrought iron gates to the graveyard groaned like a sick beast as they shoved them open. The sound was deafening in the sudden, absolute stillness of the place. Inside, the shadows were deeper, older, and colder than any street shadow. Old headstones jutted from the dry, heaving earth like crooked, decaying teeth. Moss, damp and black, clung to every available surface. The air was not just cold, it was dead. It smelled of wet stone and the faint, sweet decay of long-forgotten flowers. They found a flat, rectangular stone bench near a massive, crumbling marble angel whose face was streaked with centuries of green moss and black rainwater. Tara, suddenly methodical, took charge. She produced the salt and drew a clumsy circle around the bench. She arranged the 3 candles, lighting them one by one, the small flames struggling against the overwhelming cold. "All right, guys," she muttered, her voice unnervingly steady. "No mockery, no sudden moves. This is Halloween night. The veil is thin. You have to ask with respect." Zoe, still skeptical, leaned over the Ouija board, placing her fingers lightly on the planchette. "Respect? We're talking to dead people, Tara. What are they gonna do? Complain to the manager?" But when they all placed their hands on the smooth, cracked planchette, the jokes dried up. The temperature plummeted. The only sounds were the soft, rapid exhalations of their own breath and the faint, unsettling sizzle of the melting wax. Zoe coughed up a brittle, cynical laugh, ignoring the dread in the air, then called out in mock, spooky voice, "Oh, spirits of the dead, come talk to us before curfew." Nothing. The planchette remained glued to the center of the board. Then Tara took the lead. She closed her eyes and her tone changed from theatrics to genuine, shivering reverence. "We ask permission to speak with those who dwell beyond the living light. If there is a spirit present, give us a sign." The wind, which had been sighing through the cypress branches, suddenly stopped. The scattered dry leaves on the ground froze. The cold air pressed down on them, an invisible, crushing weight. A sudden sharp gust of wind materialized out of nowhere, not blowing past them, but directed at them. It snuffed out 2 of the 3 candles. Everyone laughed it off, except Tara. She opened her eyes, her face pale in the remaining light. "They're here," she whispered, her voice a thin thread of fear and excitement. Eli, shivering, finally broke the silence. His voice was barely a whisper. "Is anyone here with us?" The planchette, cold beneath their fingertips, twitched. It didn't slide. It shuddered, then moved a quarter of an inch, and then, with terrifying slowness, began to glide. It moved to yes. Kyle snorted, pulling his hand away quickly. "Nice one, Tara. You've been practicing that wrist flick, huh?" Tara glared at him, her eyes wide with unfeigned terror. "I swear I didn't move it. It pulled me." Zoe, though her face was tense, maintained her composure. "Okay, fine. If you're so powerful, prove it. Who are you?" The planchette moved again, grinding softly on the lacquer surface, as if the effort was monumental. It spelled out W-A-I-T. Before anyone could react, the very stone they were sitting next to answered. The marble angel statue, ancient and weathered, gave a sharp, deafening crack. The sound was loud, splitting the unnatural silence like an axe. The head of the angel, a heavy moss-covered chunk of sculpted stone, slid slowly from the shoulders, falling into the dirt with a deafening crunch. Eli let out a piercing, hysterical scream. They all scrambled backward. Kyle and Zoe burst out laughing, a sudden, frantic, terrified release. It had to be the cold, the weathering, the damp, but Tara didn't. Her voice trembled raw with shock. "It hurt us," she choked out. The terror had crossed the line into fascination. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a reckless surge of adrenaline and arrogance. They were talking to something, and it was listening. They scrambled back to the board, their caution replaced by a desperate need to push the boundary. Kyle, his face flushed from the flask he kept passing around, leaned over the board and yelled into the dark. "Hey, Stone Smasher, you waiting for something? Tell us your name, or are you just a scared little ghost?" The planchette shot across the board, faster than any human hand could push it, slamming into the letter J, then A, then C-O-B. Jacob. Tara recognized the name instantly, her voice barely a breath. "Jacob Vance. He was buried here after the trolley accident in 1918. Right over there." She pointed a trembling finger toward a tilted obelisk 10 feet away. The board answered again, spelling out a series of names rapidly. E-V-A-N-S M-C-C-A-L-L-T-H-O-M-P-S-O-N. All were old, prominent names belonging to the massive ornate crypts scattered through the cemetery. Then the game stopped being about dead strangers. The planchette scraped a new set of letters. Zoe, Kyle, Eli, Tara. The realization struck them all at once. It knew them. Eli had enough. His eyes darted wildly, seeing only shadows and the headless statue. "That's it. It's enough. We're done, Zoe. I'm packing this up." He reached for the board, but Kyle, fueled by bravado and the liquor, kicked over one of the last remaining candles. "Screw this. It's an old board. Let's go." As Kyle stood up, preparing to bolt, the temperature around the stone bench dropped again, this time so severely their breath fogged in thick white plumes. Zoe, trying to maintain control, grabbed the planchette to center it on goodbye. But the wood resisted. It began to move under her fingers, pulling hard, scraping against the varnish. The movement was no longer quick or playful. It was slow, grinding, and utterly powerful. It spelled out its demands. Not done. Not alone. The ground beneath the board, beneath the cemetery, beneath their feet began to tremble. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a localized, shallow, terrifying vibration. The dry earth around the old moss-covered graves began to heave, subtle at first, like a deep breath, and then with a sickly, rhythmic push, as if something gargantuan were straining against its earthen blanket. Zoe screamed, finally shedding her skepticism. They tried to run, but before they could take 2 steps, the dry earth next to Kyle's foot split open like a melon. A hand, skeletal and caked in black, clinging mud, shot out of the ground with impossible speed and clamped around Kyle's ankle. "Ah!" Kyle didn't mock this time. He shrieked, a sound of pure shock and pain. He collapsed, frantically kicking at the dead hand that held him fast. They scrambled away from the side of the rising horror, only to find the fog had thickened into a choking, impenetrable white cloud. As they scattered, shadows began to move between the looming, jagged shapes of the gravestones. These weren't just shadows. They were forming human shapes, slow, shambling, but purposeful. Zoe dropped her phone, the screen shattering on impact, its flashlight beam dying. Eli stumbled over a loose piece of concrete, yelling, "We need to go, now!" But the cemetery had closed around them. Every path they tried, every desperate sprint between the marble mausoleums, only seemed to wind them back to the same central oppressing clearing where the headless angel statue towered above them, silently judging their trespass. They ran deeper into the graveyard, a move born of blind panic. It was the worst possible direction. The fog was now a suffocating shroud. The few remaining candles guttered and died, swallowed by the cold. The air was thick with the reek of damp earth and the putrid smell of long dormant, rotting flesh, now exposed to the air. They saw them, not ghosts, not spectral blurs, but corpses. They were rising, slow and deliberate, shaking off their shrouds of earth. These were not cinematic zombies. They were far worse. They were the true dead. Their flesh, what little remained, hung like wet gray paper from bone. Their movements were heavy, clumsy, but imbued with a terrifying, absolute relentlessness. Their eyes were pale, filmy white spheres, catching the moonlight and gleaming with an awful, vacant intelligence. Hands burst from the ground everywhere, skeletal, mud-caked, reaching for anything warm and living. Figures climbed out of holes that were once graves, straightening their ruined bodies, their heads tilting, listening for the sound of heartbeats. Tara, scrambling backward from a figure with the jaw hanging loose, gasped in horrified recognition. "It's because it's Halloween," she screamed, her voice breaking. "The gates open both ways." They made a desperate dash for the massive wrought iron exit gate. The corpses were not fast, but they were inexorable, surrounding them in a widening circle of rising decay. They began to whisper, their voices a slurred, hollow chorus, like dry leaves being dragged across concrete. "Stay with us." Eli weeping openly now, grabbing a rustling, half-buried shovel and swung it wildly at a corpse that had stumbled too close. The shovel connected with the thing's shoulder with a dreadful, wet thwack. The corpse didn't even flinch. It merely continued its slow, single-minded shuffle, its pale eyes locked on Eli's. Kyle tried to pull Tara away from a cluster of corpses, but a grasping skeletal hand caught his wrist. He tore free, his skin sloughing off in the creature's grip, leaving a smear of pink and blood on its bone-white fingers. The two others grabbed him from behind. Kyle's arrogance vanished in a final blood-curdling, choked scream. He was dragged backward, swallowed by the thick fog, his terrified cries fading instantly into the darkness, leaving only a lingering echo. Tara, Zoe, and Eli couldn't look back. The three of them fled toward the tallest, darkest structure they could see, a squat, imposing family crypt set deep into the hill at the far edge of the cemetery. They scrambled inside, kicking their way through decades of dry cobwebs and scattered brittle, faded wreaths. The massive granite door was heavy. They threw their combined weight against it, barring it with a rusted iron rake they found inside. The dead clawed and pounded outside, their low, rustling whispers pressing against the thick stone.
Stay with us. You belong with us.
Inside the crypt, the air was thick with the smell of dust and an ancient, ever-present chill. Tara realized the horrible truth. She pointed over to Eli. Zoe hesitantly glanced over to him. He was leaning against the cold stone, breathing in short, shallow gasps. His skeleton costume was torn, and the skin around his forearm was turning a ghastly, speckled shade, like bruised fruit. He was weakening rapidly, muttering frantic nonsense about needing to call his mother. The wound from the creature's bite was already working its lethal magic. Eli found an old matchbox, his hands shaking violently, but he managed to strike a match and light a small candle he'd found. The tiny flame barely held back the engulfing dark. "We have to send them back," Tara whispered, clutching her bag. "Maybe if we finish the ritual, show respect, we can maybe close the gate." Zoe, her eyes wild, grabbed the Ouija board they had dropped outside. It was smeared with mud and dust, but intact. She slammed it into the cold stone floor. There was no time for finesse. There was only time for desperate, frantic bargaining. She didn't use the planchet. She screamed the final question directly at the wood, at the darkness, at the stone walls that held them captive. "What do you want from us? What do you need to rest? Please, send them back!" The planchet, lying next to the board, lifted slightly, then began to slide on its own, propelled by a cold, invisible force, grinding over the dust-coated surface. It spelled out, simply and irrevocably, life. Tara stared at the word, her eyes contorted in abject horror. "It wants a sacrifice," she whispered, utterly defeated. "It wants one of us." Before Zoe could even process the words, before she could scream a refusal, or try to smash the board, the candle flame suddenly and violently snuffed out. The darkness was instant, absolute, and deafening. In that crushing blackness, Zoe heard one last, faint sound, a quick, wet drag across the smooth stone. Then, silence. When the light flickered back, Tara frantically lighting a match, Eli was gone. Only his painted skeleton sneakers remained, sitting exactly where he had sat, abandoned, empty. The dead outside suddenly went quiet. The pounding ceased. The wind stopped its mournful sighing. The awful hollow whispers ceased. The air in the crypt lifted, the oppressive cold receding. The veil, having taken its due, had closed. The heavy granite crypt door suddenly burst open, swinging inward with the terrible rasping sound of unoiled hinges. The night outside was a silent, peaceful, washed in the first clean light of dawn's gray promise. The undead were gone. Zoe and Tara stumbled out into the stillness, trembling, their bodies moving purely on instinct. Everything looked normal, too normal. But in the grass, just feet from the crypt entrance, two ancient, cracked gravestones had been replaced. Two new ones stood, pristine against the dark earth, their inscriptions fresh and cruelly legible. Eli Carter died October 31st. Kyle Wagner died October 31st. Zoe dropped to her knees, screaming a raw animal sound of denial and absolute loss, her voice echoing over the quiet cemetery hills. The price had been paid. The next morning, a pair of municipal workers, bundled in thick coats, came to clean up any mess left by the storms or any miscreants. The main wrought iron gate was bent and its chain snapped. They found scattered scraps of torn, muddy fabric, a piece of a black catsuit, a tattered vampire cape, and a shredded, bloodied football jersey. "Stupid kids," one worker muttered, kicking a candle that had been left behind. They always gotta take it too far on Halloween. In the background, unnoticed by the living faint ghostly shapes, not the solid horrors of the night before, but mere smoky disturbances, shuffled contently among the ancient tombstones. The workers eventually stopped near Eli's freshly installed grave, wondering how a brand new stone had appeared there overnight. Resting neatly atop the mound of loose dark dirt was the Ouija board, planchet atop. As the workers walked away, the planchet, without a breath of wind or a touch from any living hand, began to move slowly across the board. It slid into the middle, resting finally over a message that had been etched into the wood long ago. Goodbye.
Well, my dearly departed, I suppose that's what happens when you refuse to hang up on the afterlife. Those meddling mediums wanted to make contact, and boy, did they ever get a return call. Guess that poor Eli and Kyle learned the hard way that sometimes the dead just want a little life support. So next time you're tempted to chat with the beyond, remember, my fiends, best to not speak of the dead unless you're dying for an answer.
Tales from the Crypt.